I might have stumbled into a possible, potentially groundbreaking new hypothesis for why humanity outcompeted other early humans, why civilization developed, and it all comes back to scarcity, which Bitcoin has now perfected.
You're almost making the case of like money as a keystone to civilization itself, right? Perhaps even more so than natural language.
You can't really live in an existence beyond 150 people if you're pre-money. But then if you have the concept of money, that ceiling is removed.
The theory was that Homo sapiens outcompeted Neanderthals because they adopted monotheism first.
Money is really the enabler that then makes it possible for larger social groups to live together. And then in that context, having shared gods starts to help with the cohesiveness.
And that global optimum became gold, basically.
Yes.
Now
it's possible to have a scarcer good that's suitable as money.
Have we perfected scarcity in Bitcoin?
If we shift from an inflationary flywheel of everything getting worse,
prices go up, quality go down.
Yep, and that's because we have an inflationary monetary standard. And if you have a deflationary monetary standard,
your money buys more over time.
And then those people see their lives getting better over time. This is what we've been searching for our entire species history.
So you've written this piece, Once in a Species, and it loosely goes through the development of the human brain, economic scarcity, money, and the birth of Bitcoin. I guess before we kind of start dissecting this thing section by section, do you want to give like just a high level description of what this piece is, why you wrote it, et cetera?
Yeah. So this is kind of building on a fantastic essay called Shelling Out by Nick Szabo, which he wrote in 2002. And in that essay, he lays out the case that all the evidence we see in caveman cave sites of shell bead jewelry is really proto-money. Mm-hmm. So this is our first form of money as a species that we would have collected these seashells, strung them up, and they would have been valued because it's hard to make more of them. Their seashells are beautiful, and then making a shell bead necklace takes time and energy and skill. It would have taken dozens of hours to make a single necklace, and it would have been very hard to make an additional necklace, especially if you were inland. So that necklace served as a store of value, an asset that was recognized as valuable that you could use in major life events. And Szabo does a fantastic job of laying that out. And he also leaves a few threads unexplored in that piece. He sort of suggests that it's interesting how we don't see shell bead jewelry in Neanderthal cave sites. And it's also interesting that Homo sapiens had 10 times the population density as Neanderthals in their cave sites.
How do they determine that? Is it just artifactual or?
Yeah, so it's in the sediment layers in a cave, you can see like in the timeline when Neanderthals would have been there, and you see the amount of stuff they're producing. Mm-hmm. And then, fast forward a few sediment layers, now it's Homo sapiens, and there's a lot more stuff being produced, a lot more bones showing up from the amount of food they're eating.
Got it.
So those are interesting disparities between the Neanderthal cave sites and Homo sapiens. And Szabo kind of wonders if perhaps money was a part of that story. And he mostly leaves it there. So what I wanted to do with this piece was update that, because that was over 2 decades ago, and see if there, was any further links that I could expand on that, pull on those threads that he leaves unexplored. And I was kind of surprised by what I found when I sat down and did the research over the last 4 to 6 months. The rabbit hole opened up much bigger than I expected. And I found myself breaking new ground with the hypothesis that I put forward here.
Very cool. I love that piece, by the way, Shelling Out. And when I first got into Bitcoin, it was Nick Szabo's work on smart contracts.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of the first like aha moments I had about, then it was broadly crypto, like a crypto aha moment, but it was leading me towards really the Bitcoin standard and all these other things. So his work is amazing. It's quite dense.
Yes.
Very well cited, like really good work, but
and I try to follow that lineage too of like, I made sure to go dig up all of his sources and do my homework to make sure I wasn't missing anything. And I pulled on some of his source material for some of my findings.
Yes, that's great. And the anthropology / money crossover is very interesting because it's kind of controversial, right? Like we don't, that's probably why he didn't go into it too much, I suppose.
Yeah. So Szabo lays out this hypothesis that, shell bead jewelry was proto money, and fast forward 20 years and mainstream anthropology has not, absorbed that. They still continue to interpret all of these findings, from over the last 20 years, we've found a lot more examples of shell bead jewelry and new excavations of cave sites. And they always talk about them in terms of like self-expression and personal identity and fashion. And totally miss the economic reality of what this behavior is. Yeah, which is very funny, and I think I take some pot shots at anthropology in general. In this piece because it's a shame that if you're trying to understand human behavior with a narrow, siloed version of understanding, then of course you're going to miss out on trying to understand what so much of human behavior is driven by economics. Of course. And if you're going to try to understand human behavior without economics, good luck.
Right. Yeah, it's well said. It seems like a notable blind spot in any of the social sciences. They sort of ignore the economic component unless you're really in Austrian economics. And I'd say even the Keynesian economics, they ignore the economic component because it's just kind of bullshit the way they construct their models. Yeah,
I think that's kind of the just like two dings against Szabo and also I guess my work here of the anthropologists only want to focus on what's orthodox in anthropology, and then if you want to talk about economics, well, it's especially taboo to talk about Austrian economics because that's not accepted by economics at all. So sorry, economists.
No, that's a good point. And I think about this a lot, that economics is maybe not the youngest science. I guess computer science might be the youngest science now, but prior to computer science, economics is, as when Mises was writing in the 1940s, he often called economics the youngest science. Yeah. So, it's very early basically in kind of the grand scale of its evolutionary path, especially when you look at something like, well, even anthropology or psychology. Psychology goes all the way back into astrology, for instance. Jung said that was like the collective knowledge we had on psychology up until a point was contained in astrology, for instance. So like economics is a good proxy for this. Like until the mid 1800s, people thought that value was an objective thing in the world, right? They used to talk about the util as like, this bottle has 17 utils and this phone has 80 utils. Therefore, this phone is more valuable than the bottle. Whereas in fact, we know now that it's all subjective preference, somewhat obviously. So I try to remember that we're contending with that. I often say we're coming out of the economic dark ages. Yeah. So it's unsurprising to see that a lot of these other disciplines just have this as a blind spot. And maybe you see this at the individual level, right? That even talking about money is somewhat taboo. Yep. So maybe there's like a generality associated with that into scientific disciplines. Yeah.
And I think it's part of what's so interesting about trying to understand Bitcoin too. And the real motivation for this piece is to try to put Bitcoin in the context of monetary history, and also to try to help explain like why are we so drawn to Bitcoin? Like what is it about Bitcoin scarcity in particular that's so compelling to us? And I think this piece does a good job of landing on like possibly a root driver for that tendency, and that it's economics at the end of the day, and it's kind of remarkable that we've had, for all of human history, going back hundreds of thousands of years, we haven't understood the economics of what's driving, how our species is played out and how our lives are oriented. And now Bitcoin kind of lands on the scene and forces us to try to like make sense of why am I personally choosing to divert my 401k into internet funny money, and I'm quite confident that is a better choice than the default. And it forces you to try to learn about economics, Austrian economics, in order to make sense of that instinct.
Yes. Yeah. As you're saying, I don't know why this came up. It's like as if once you start to grok Austrian economics or the origins of money, as you'll go into, you start to get a new interpretive layer or interpretive structure through which to interpret reality, right? Historically. So there's this saying that, sometimes you catch a criminal and a whole string of crimes is solved. It's like, I think when you start to look through the money lens at history and from a praxeological standpoint of individual human action, things start to make a lot more sense. Like intuition and rationality kind of find some middle ground, I suppose. So definitely a very important piece. And you do call it, again, once in a species. So I'm sure we're building towards a big bull case for Bitcoin here.
Yes.
But you start in art and humanity's relationship with art.
Yeah.
Where should we begin there?
I guess when you're thinking about early man, the thing that pops to mind first is cave art, and you think about how there are these echoes, these fingerprints of ourselves that we see in this art that's propagated through time. And it's striking and it's very human, right? And I think it's interesting that I sort of my starting point for the piece is people often say that art is what makes us human. And, that's kind of part of our mythos as a species. And I walked through a few examples of very old art, a figurine that's 30,000 years old, and then, kind of your classic cave art of Pleistocene megafauna in France, also 30,000 years old. And then very interestingly, there's a recent discovery. In 2024, they dated a handprint in a cave in Spain to 66,000 years ago. That makes it the oldest cave art that we know of. But there's a problem with that because humanity didn't arrive in Europe for another 20,000 years. So that hand is a Neanderthal hand. And that means that Neanderthals were engaging in some kind of very human art. And that's different from how we understand or culturally have understood Neanderthals over the last 150 years. And I use that as a jumping off point to the other things that we've misunderstood about Neanderthals over the last few decades in particular. This picture of Neanderthals as very much like us has emerged. So it's not, the common conception of Neanderthals is that they were the prototypical dumb caveman, but they had the same level of tool sophistication as us and weapons. They seemed to have language. Their brains were slightly bigger than ours. And they had existed in Europe for 200,000 years before we showed up. And yet we displaced them, drove them extinct in 3,000 to 5,000 years after we arrived, very quickly. So if there's no clear difference between, the emerging picture of how Neanderthals lived and how we lived, like what was the difference maker? And that's where Szabo's clues, his threads that he doesn't pull on, are very interesting, because the two notable differences are that Neanderthal cave sites don't seem to have shell bead jewelry, and human cave sites do. I'm using human here. Neanderthals are humans.
Yeah.
But, Homo sapiens is typically what we think of as humans. So Homo sapien cave sites have shell bead jewelry, and Homo sapien cave sites have 10x the population density. So something there could be what's driving it. And then, later in the piece, I add a few more elements that we'll get into that tie it all together.
That, I think, dovetails really nicely with one of the more recent definitions of money and this one I think I formulated, but again, I may have heard it somewhere. I'm not really sure, but the idea of money being like a stranger cooperation technology, that it actually allows us to scale past the Dunbar number in terms of our social groups and then increase population density, as you're saying, obviously with that, the division of labor, productivity, et cetera. Does that sound about right? Like it allows those social groups to just grow larger than they otherwise would be. So obviously they would outcompete smaller social groups.
Yes. So that's another element here that in my research, this hypothesis sort of helps to answer. I've always found it interesting that Dunbar, so Robin Dunbar in 1992 puts out this study on neocortex volume and the number of individuals in primate social groups. And so, this is early in this type of science. So he, studies the brain volume of various primates and then plots that brain volume against the social group size that these species tend to be found in. And he draws a linear regression. And based on our brain volume, that line intersects with 150 individuals for a social group size. So that study predicts that humans would naturally gravitate to 150 individuals, or at least be bounded by 150 individuals based on what our neocortex is large enough to keep track of. And that is pretty accurate. That's kind of a natural tribal existence size social group. And, we see that in modern life. There's a lot of social institutions are kind of structured around that, like no more than 150 individuals, whether that's like a social club or like a fraternity or sorority or military regiment. That's a pretty common bound to have. And it feels right too, like that, you can keep up with 150 people and not really beyond that. So Dunbar puts that out in a seminal piece of work and now known as Dunbar's number. The following year, he puts out another study that adds like an efficiency multiplier to try to explain away one of the problems with Dunbar's number. And that's based on the amount of time that primates are spending in one-on-one socializing. If you have a social group of 150, the math works out to you'd expect to spend 42% of the day socializing. And we don't do that. So how? Like how are we able to maintain stable social relationships without spending that much time socializing? And his answer is language, and specifically social gossip. So it's a lot more efficient to, maintain your bonds by chatting, and gossiping. It's a great explanation. I think it's very right. But what it doesn't address is the reality that we live in circumstances where we have larger than 150 person surroundings, right? We live in cities, towns. How is it that we are able to do that beyond Dunbar's number? And there hasn't been like a tidy explanation for that. And in the piece here, I bring that in because I think that the concept of money helps explain it's an additional efficiency multiplier that unbounds us from Dunbar's number. And specifically, the problem, I think, with Dunbar's number, I think what he may have actually captured there is that, and Szabo talks about this a little bit, but he doesn't directly tie it to Dunbar. In a pre-money existence, you're living in a tribe and you're incurring debts, doing favors with individuals in the tribe, and you have a mental ledger with every pair of counterparties has a mental ledger of who's given what to who owes the other. And the only way to track that is for everyone else in the social group to be vaguely aware of that. So that the social group can enforce those debts.
Right.
Because without that, you have no, you could back out of
You can defraud the counterparty.
Yeah.
This is kind of like the Rystone thing, right?
Yeah,
The public accountability side of it, yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's part of why the Rystone thing worked.
Yes.
So the problem with that is that when you get to 150 individuals, based on combinatorial math, that's 11,000 counterparty pairs. And so the social group has to then be vaguely aware of 11,000 mental ledgers. And that's I think where it becomes impossible for us to keep up with. So, it's not that hard to imagine having a relationship with more than 150 people, but it's kind of impossible to imagine like keeping track of 11,000 other counterparties outside of your own reality. And therefore, once you get beyond 150, the ability of the social group to enforce debts starts to break down. So you can't really live in an existence beyond 150 people,
right,
if you're pre-money.
Yeah.
But then if you have the concept of money, that ceiling is removed because now you can settle your debts real time based on a transfer of a suitable form of money. And that makes it possible to have like an infinite number of counterparties that you interact with. So it removes Dunbar's number, but then it has this additional benefit that I think is possibly more powerful, which is in a tribal existence, the default for your relationship with other tribes is antagonism, right? So you're going to live in your tribe in your little valley, and the tribe in the next valley over is going to be your competition, right? Like you would end up with blood feuds.
Yeah.
Because, they killed your uncle.
Right. Turf wars.
Yeah. You can have some turf wars and you have no means of settling those feuds, right? Like all you have is violence. All you have is competition.
Yeah.
But then if you have the concept of money, it creates this constructive medium for positive intertribal relationships.
The division of labor.
Yeah, and you can start to have, you can have truces. You can peacemake. You can pay tribute. You can engage in rudimentary trade, right? Like much more easily than you can with barter. And that makes it so that you can have a relationship with, your neighboring tribes that's constructive.
Yeah.
You can start to gravitate towards like mutual security alliances where, you watch our back, we'll watch yours. We're stronger together and trade as a benefit. And then you start to gravitate towards tribes living in close proximity because if the neighboring tribe is your enemy, you want a big buffer and you're going to try to stay away from them. You're going to try to keep boundaries and you're not going to interact with them. But if the tribe next door is a positive force for you and you want them kind of closer, you start to live in the same valley. And that's how you start to support 10 times the population density versus the archaic humans that didn't have that relationship with each other.
Wow. What a great explanation. Have you ever wanted to live in an off-grid community with complete food, energy, and water independence? If so, then you need to check out the farm at Okefenokee. The farm is a pioneering community designed to foster longevity and well-being, eliminating elements that detract from these goals. At the farm, the convergence of nature, nutritious food, a supportive community, and the ethos of slowing down is unparalleled. Positioned at the gateway to the UNESCO World Heritage-nominated Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, the farm at Okefenokee stands as a testament to a lifestyle that truly nurtures health and happiness. Unlike conventional housing developments where a token communal garden may suffice, the farm itself is the community. Small, intimate micro-villages seamlessly integrate into the fabric of a sprawling agricultural community. So if you're interested in joining this off-grid community, then go to okefarm.com today to learn more about becoming a member. Make sure to tell them that I sent you for a $21,000 discount on their custom cabin pricing. Again, go to okefarm.com to learn more about joining this revolutionary regenerative agriculture community. iCoin Technology has released a slick new hardware wallet. It looks like a mini iPhone with a high-res 3-inch touchscreen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, and no GPS. It is an air-gapped hardware wallet which uses QR codes and a camera to communicate with the Bitcoin network. It has a built-in camera which is required for air-gap operation, and it has an optional Bluetooth compatibility. It's really a brand new user interface and user experience for a Bitcoin hardware wallet. iCoin makes self-custody accessible, easy to use, and non-intimidating. It even comes with an optional custom iCoin thermal printer so you can print out the private key and its associated QR code when you're setting up the wallet. This makes setup quick and simple. Also, it is easy to restore the wallet just by reading the seed phrase QR code with the wallet camera. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like the iCoin wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. So go to iCointechnology.com/breedlove today for 30% off the purchase of this sleek new hardware wallet. Again, that's iCointechnology.com/breedlove. You're almost making the case of like money as a keystone to civilization itself, right? Perhaps even more so than natural language, probably way more than natural language.
100%.
It's not enough to even speak the language of your neighbor tribe, right? If you guys can't engage productively, mutually productive trade, mutually beneficial trade, let's say, then it's much more likely inter-tribal relations will devolve into the zero-sum game of conquer and conquest, right? Rather than the division of labor, right?
Yep.
And it reminds me of that old, was it Bastiat, right? If goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. So
right.
that kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
And I really think, I mean, this is so important to reflect upon this, that the amount of strangers we interact with on a daily basis, we just take it for granted now, right? It's like, I just go out into the world, hop in the car, you drive next to a bunch of strangers, which by the way is amazing. You're in a machine flying down the road at 70 miles an hour. Like that in and of itself is an economic miracle.
Yep.
And then you just park wherever, you pay some parking lot owner through a parking number on a sign. You walk into a store, you hand them a piece of plastic, they give you food or drink. Like we take all this for granted, but that doesn't exist. That's almost, I don't know if it's the soul. It's a defining feature of humanity versus animals, right? You see animals doing the first thing we talked about, right? They have turf, and where the two turfs touch, there tends to be bloodshed.
Yep.
Right. They don't cooperate and, trade and all of these things. And so this idea of money as a stranger, what did I say earlier? Stranger cooperation scaling technology. Mm-hmm. And I think you also see the inverse when you look at an economy going through hyperinflation, right? It's like that all evaporates. Yep. And then it's just, you can only trust like the people you live with, or maybe a couple of friends if you're lucky. And people are like going crazy, they're stealing from each other. They're eating their pets. They're like, it's a mass psychosis basically once you pull the money out.
Yep.
And so like all these things, I think, reinforce your point that money is very instrumental, if not indispensable, to our evolution as a civilized animal.
Completely. I make the case here that money is the foundational building block of human civilization. That, if you have the concept of money, you trend towards greater cooperation, coordination, centralization of population too. And, I think it's hard for us to, when you're driving down the road in a car and you're paying with an app for parking,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to remember, or we don't remember. It's hard to conceive of the very beginnings of that civilizational development.
Yes.
And I think it just starts with the vector of money helping to make human cooperation productive rather than a default to violence. And so that's a light switch, right? Like if you have the concept of money, you know, it's not a zero sum game. It's net beneficial for you to interact with others. If you find rudimentary capitalism, and then you play that process out for tens of thousands of years, and you end up in the civilization we're in. But that's a slow process with lots of false starts, I think. But it needs that vector of pushing things in a constructive direction because money is creating that dynamic.
Yeah, that's so. Yeah, it's like the key ingredient to transforming our relations from zero sum game to positive sum game, right? From zero sum game politics, war, let's say, to positive sum game economics and production.
Exactly.
Did you think, but we're in much larger groups now. We're in like nation state groups. So, 330 million people in the US. Have we reached some kind of ceiling in that, maybe gold and gold-backed currency and now fiat currency has now somehow hit a limit on that? So we still have these much larger tribes that are warring among each other? Yeah,
that I haven't thought about that. That's a very interesting point, that it's possible that based on the monetary technology we have, that we run into these sort of a possible ceiling. I guess I lean towards capitalism is functioning. The world gets better through technological development, and the politics of fiat and our current era may be a drag on that, but the compounding benefits of technological improvement through capitalism are lasting. So I guess I'd probably say it would be like a drag, and something like Bitcoin might reduce that drag.
Yes. Yeah. Because if you frame it as like capitalism proper, right? Like universal protection of, let's just say, property rights, or universal respect for private property rights. When you get the gold-backed currency, you get the whole man-in-the-middle attack problem, right? How do you trust the custodian? And so that kind of hamstrings capitalism a little bit, right? Because all of a sudden they start overissuing the paper. The money becomes fraudulent, basically. And then in that money becoming fraudulent, you get little tax farms, basically, called nation states. Whereas Bitcoin presumably could break that or fix that by not allowing the money to separate from the informational layer. You're like unity between the energetic and the informational layer that can't be broken. Whereas that was broken with gold-backed currency.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. I think, in many ways, Bitcoin, we'll find out. I think that Bitcoin reverses a lot of the societal decay that we see with the politics of fiat, with the drag of fiat, and the vicious cycle of inflation, causing the enshittification of everything.
That's a technical term for sure. Okay, one more question about this, and we'll get back to the essay. But with this increase in population density enabled by money, do you think this also sort of incentivizes people to develop normative structures, moralities, like things to get along a little better? Because you all of a sudden you're living on top of each other.
Yeah, and I think this is like a coevolution of many of the properties of civilization that are required for us to build more and more advanced and larger civilizations. As soon as you have this dynamic of tribes starting to live in closer proximity because they have a concept of money that facilitates that, now you've got new problems that they were probably experimented with, and then maybe it took thousands of years to figure out how to have a model that allows for you to progress to the next level. But maybe you're living with 3 tribes or 10 tribes in the same valley, you know, and you have to figure out, okay, who's the big chief, you know, and how do you deal with tribute between multiple tribes? How do we navigate that and have a process for that? And trial by error, you know, you figure that out. And I think that's part of why it took us tens of thousands of years to get to this point in civilization. Is nobody knows how to, in that context, how to build a civilization, but you're going to figure it out based on what works and what gives you a competitive edge against neighboring multi-tribe units.
Right. Because there's one other thing here. I've heard the theory that, I don't know, tell me if this is a mainstream anthropological thing or not. I'm not sure. I just heard this somewhere and I can't tell you where. The theory was that Homo sapiens outcompeted Neanderthals because they adopted monotheism first.
Yeah, that's a popular one. I also don't remember where that comes from originally, but that's a very popular explanation. And I think we have had a lot of theories, a lot of possible explanations for, you know, why did Homo sapiens outcompete Neanderthals and the handful of other early human species that existed on the planet for the last 2 million years. And then all of a sudden Homo sapiens take over. So why? That's the core question of this piece. And monotheism, theism, really, and shared myth have been some of the explanations, but they don't have like a satisfying like mechanic for like why that would give an edge. I mean, it's kind of hand wavy of like, okay, yeah, we're all on the same page a little bit more if we believe in the same gods. Yeah,
I was going to say it's like a softer claim than the money claim in a way, because it's the ability to collaborate towards a shared purpose that allows the larger group to be more socially integrated.
Right.
And so monotheism would provide that to some extent, but with like looser incentives, whereas money is much more of a real network effect, right?
Yes. And bottoms up too. You know, like from an individual's perspective, like economic motivations are what dictate what you do. Like whether or not you're thinking about it in terms of economics or not, like are you going to go venture out to try to go, you know, bag a deer up the valley, or are you going to go do something else with your time? Like you're calculating what's in your interest. And the shared myth or theism interpretation doesn't have that. It just suggests that, you know, the group would be a little bit more cohesive because you share the same gods.
Yes.
And so I think it's part of it.
Yeah.
But I think that pointing at that as the reason is less satisfying to me.
Yes. Yeah, it feels a little bit like the tail wagging the dog, perhaps.
Completely.
Because one of the common denominators between money and religion, and this will be like a Szabo term, is that they both enable trust minimization, which is another way of saying like it reduces the cost of developing rapport or trust between people, right? If we're both Christians and we know we're going to do, you know, I can generally expect you to follow these patterns and you can do the same for me. So there's not a lot of difficulty in us aligning our efforts towards productive ends. That's there with religion, but with money, it's tighter. And if anything, I would think it was almost like the money came first and then maybe the monotheism follows.
Yeah. That would be in line with my hypothesis here of, money is really the enabler that then makes it possible for larger social groups to live together. And then in that context, having shared gods starts to help with the cohesiveness. Yes. But it's not the reason that tribes were able to come together.
Yes. Yeah. That's a great point. And this is just coming to me, Mircea Eliade. He's written a lot of books on mythology. And one of my biggest takeaways from reading some of his books was that mythology tended to echo the technological paradigm. So like if they're hunters and gatherers and all their gods were like hunter, gatherer, god, you know, and then if you become agricultural, then they have agricultural gods. So it's like, there's always the mythology becomes a representation of like the technological realities they're living in day to day. And so maybe money is one of these technological realities that just hasn't been given enough, taken seriously enough to maybe contribute to the development of monotheism.
Yeah, completely agree with that. I think that's like an overarching theme here is that for whatever reason, these shell beads that show up in cave site excavations are overlooked for the importance that they likely played in our species having an advantage over other early human species. Because, I guess it's easy to think, okay, it's a necklace. Like, okay, that's just something that Homo sapiens were doing because they wanted to look good.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a great little quote that I poke fun at in the piece where the most recent big discovery of shell bead jewelry from a cave site in Morocco that's 142,000 years old. So it's the oldest known example of this behavior. The co-author of that study speculates that this jewelry was probably made as a way to signal the individual's identity to strangers because you don't need to do that to your mother. It's like, it's not, okay. So you think that this incredible find, which is actually the earliest known proto money in human history, is just some cute bit of fashion that early man was doing. It's a shame.
Well, and it also, again, tail wagging the dog, because you're not really going to have fashion proper without money.
No, and we've found shell bead jewelry in cave sites all over Africa, all over Europe and Asia, over more than 100,000 years of human history. And so you're telling me that they all just like to look good for strangers? Like, that's a bit of a stretch.
And they weren't even able to cooperate with strangers if they didn't have money, right?
That's right.
The point. So that's so interesting. One other thing that's coming to mind here, because we've talked about money's indispensability to the even the starting of civilization and then the ongoing improvement of the process of civilization, right? And, I've been reading Safeteen's book recently, The Principles of Economics. And one of the points he continually goes back to that Hoppe and others cite is that the process of civilization is a reflection of time preference, right? So it's like individuals have time preference, and then the collective reflection of that in the market pricing systems, the natural interest rate, and then the process of civilization sort of follows from it. There was something that, and money, obviously, like once you get into these monetary economies, time preference being the rate at which you discount the future to the present, right? So the more uncertain the future, the more you would discount it, basically. And so money is this thing that lets you discount the future less, like to the extent that it's working. You can just go and just grow apples, for instance, and you know that if you sell them for money, that you can use that money, save up that money to go and buy a house or do some other long distance future goal. Whereas outside of a money economy, you can't think that far ahead, basically. And this was tying to something, I think Nietzsche said this, that like his idea was that the creditor-debtor relationship was like the first impetus for human beings to think about their future self in that way. And so I guess I'm wondering here, like, are we describing humans that kind of, I don't know if discover time preference is the right, because they don't really discover time preference. It's not like they're sitting around saying like, hey, all of a sudden I realize my future self likes this more, but you're coming to realize through using, your day-to-day transactions with money that you can now accumulate this stuff and save up for bigger things and do longer term projects. Is that what we're describing? Like people start to come online with the realities of time preference through money?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think probably next we'll get into the like beginnings of this money and like how that would have developed. But once you have that, then you want more. Like once you have the concept of money, you value money, shell beads in this case. you want more of that, and you are probably starting to think about, okay, how can I get more value?
Yeah.
And now you're starting to think in terms of capitalism.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause it's a means to all material ends. So no matter what you're trying to do in life, it's like you can now, it simplifies the process of fulfilling your dream, basically.
Yep. And how to make your life better, and how to, make your kin better off.
Right.
So, it sort of dovetails with a lot of like Dawkins' work of, the selfish gene, and wanting to make sure that, the actions that you take help propagate your lineage.
Yes.
Right. And money is a tool for doing that.
Yes.
And valuing, once you have the concept of money, then it becomes clear that that's a way to get an edge in life.
Yes.
And I think that's very natural. I think that's part of humanity's strengths and our competitive advantage. But you have to get that concept of money first.
Yes.
And I think that's the thing that we don't think enough about, in terms of, we don't think enough about, what is money, and we don't think enough about what does it mean to have the concept of money when your competition does not.
Yes. Yeah. It's a great point. It's another one of these things we kind of take for granted. Like we don't know what it's like to think without natural language. Like it's almost impossible to even think what that would be like. And money maybe is not that extreme. You can imagine what it's like to not have money, but when you consider how your day-to-day life is carried out, that's not possible without money. It also gives, I guess, people this ability to start, again, back to time preference. Like once you can accumulate money and you can calculate in money, you start thinking more about the future. You think beyond your own life. You start thinking about your legacy. Oh, I can accumulate these things to pass forward to my kin. And then they can, layer by layer, build up things of really substantial value.
Yeah. And that's part of what Szabo lays out of, what's the immediate advantage? What's the reason for carrying, several shell bead necklaces on your body at all times? And the reality is, like, you could get in a pinch, you could run into a bad situation. Maybe your tribe dies, and suddenly you need to like befriend another tribe, or maybe you need to just get some resources, and you have this stored value hanging around your neck that you can put to work to save your life. Yes. And that's a huge evolutionary advantage right there.
Yes, absolutely. So many definitions of money are coming to mind now as you say that. I had a biologist on here and he described money as liquid fitness.
Love it.
So it's like, in a Darwinian sense, it allows you to get fit to almost any situation. As you were describing there, it's like an insurance policy against uncertainty itself.
Yes.
Like no matter what happens, it's like, well, you have the widest set of options possible if you're holding money to deal with whatever that eventuality is. We should probably talk about scarcity.
Yep.
As Safety often says, scarcity is the starting point of all economics. Hoppe also says scarcity is the starting point of all morality. Like we wouldn't have morality if it weren't for the reality of scarcity, which gets back into morality being like kind of a tool more than a software package instead of something more ephemeral. How does scarcity play into this narrative of both money and civilization coming online together?
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about, in my research, I found a neuroscience breakthrough from 2022. So pretty recent that, made a little bit of a splash, but I don't think, people realized how potentially significant this discovery is, and it comes back to scarcity. So Pinson et al. Found that we have a mutation in a specific gene section creates a protein called TKTL1 versus Neanderthals and other earlier humans and primates. They all have a different version, an archaic ATKTL1, and we have HTKTL1. That amounted to a single nucleotide change in that relevant section of the DNA that meant a different amino acid in that portion, in that string of amino acids, and that meant a slightly different folded protein. And that relevant gene, TKTL1, is involved in neurogenesis, promoting the development and growth of new neurons, specifically in the supragranular layers, the outermost layers of the frontal lobe. So think about like the outermost layers of the front half of your brain. This gene is involved in growing new neurons there. And when I read about this, I got a degree in neuroscience, my undergrad 15 years ago, and I remembered vaguely that those areas have what are called association cortices. It's a funny neuronal wiring centers that take information from various domains and synthesize it and then generalize it into abstract thought. So, pulling information from all over the brain about various things and then turning it into abstract conceptualizations. And so that's what those areas do. And here we have a variation, a mutation in that relevant gene that makes us potentially three times as much neurogenesis in those areas versus Neanderthals or other earlier humans. And that stuck out to me. So we have this mutation that makes us have a greater capacity for abstract thought. And what comes out of abstract thought is symbolic behavior. Mm-hmm. So that's art. It's also appreciating and valuing scarce assets. Mm. And that's the basis for collectibles. Like shells and any other collectibles today too. And so that right there potentially explains this difference that we see in the cave site archaeology of Neanderthals versus Homo sapiens. That's why we had all this shell jewelry. Mm-hmm. Is because we had a greater capacity to appreciate and value things that were rare, things that were scarce, things that were hard to make more of. So I think, the way I thought about it is from the point of view of like a Neanderthal, they're very much like us, living their lives, full range of human emotions. And then here are these Homo sapiens who are total weirdos who are obsessed with collecting shell beads, right? And stringing them up and then carrying them around because for whatever reason, they love them. They think that
stacking shells,
the scarcity is so cool and they want to own more of it. Mm-hmm. And so that would be just this weird evolutionary quirk, right? Mm-hmm. That all comes back to this single nucleotide point mutation that made our, protein slightly different for us and supercharged neurogenesis in the relevant areas of the brain. But that is the basis for us developing the concept of money, because what it takes to develop the concept of money, that Menger lays out and Szabo draws on as well, is this path-dependent process of going from some small portion of the social group valuing a collectible, and then the rest of the social group realizing that certain individuals in the group care about that collectible. So that collectible has trade value, market value. Mm-hmm. So then everybody starts to recognize that collectible as having value, which is the basis of intersubjective value. Yes. So now that shells have value in that social group, and it becomes a store of value asset, right? And then once it's a store of value asset for a majority of people, it becomes a medium of exchange. You can settle trade in that unit. And then once most trade is done in that unit, it's the unit of account, a path-dependent process of a collectible becoming money. But what's not addressed in all that is what kickstarts us valuing the collectible in the first place. And this genetic mutation could be, and I think probably is, the reason why we go from, not not caring about picking up seashells on the seashore to suddenly becoming obsessed with doing so. And it's just because we had this supercharged, overdeveloped area of our brain that it appreciates scarcity, appreciates something that is hard to make more of, something that's unusual. Because if you think about a caveman context, sticks and stones, but then you see like a beautiful little shell.
Yeah.
That's special. That's something different. And you would pick that up. But the fact that we don't see that, we don't see seashells in Neanderthal cave sites, suggests that they wouldn't have.
Wow.
So that, that's the difference between us. And that difference was what was necessary to develop, to have the critical mass of covetous interest in scarce assets that's necessary to begin the monetization process.
Right. Okay. Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com. Because you have to create the initial reservation demand for this thing to get it off the ground as a collectible, to get it off the ground as a store of value, and so on and so forth. Is it related? So maybe there is some truth in the anthropology here that they were collecting these things for purposes of beauty or adornment. Initially.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, why do you pick up a seashell?
The same is true with gold, right? Like you picking up this shiny thing. Yeah.
You pick it up because it's beautiful, but then there's something else too of like, how hard it is to find that. And so it's like, you can pick it up and admire it and then set it back down, but you don't. You take it home with you, right? Like, why is that? It's because that that's uncommon.
Right. Okay.
And for whatever reason, because of this reason, we have that in our DNA, in our brain development to have like a greater covetous interest in these things that are scarce and special and precious.
Yes.
It's almost like Gollum in Lord of the Rings. I mean, like that's part of our brains to just covet these precious little things.
It's funny you use the word covet too. I think it's the 10th commandment telling us not to covet.
Yeah, right.
Not to covet our neighbor's stuff, right? Yeah. I guess it's okay to naturally appropriate things like you're describing.
Yeah, right. And again, this is evolution just having a mistake, really, right? Where like one nucleotide was switched and it resulted in a protein that was way more effective at doing its job, which turned us into weirdos, right? But like that being weirdos was the behavioral advantage that unlocked the concept of money, which is then the basis for civilization.
Right. That's so interesting. I also wonder here too, and I guess it's very murky and difficult to determine, but like if it could have been the actions of maybe collecting these seashells early on that then unlocked the mutation. You know, like we often think it's kind of like brain mutation out into action, but then sometimes I wonder if there are actions that were sort of triggering mutations in the brain. It's probably circular in most cases.
Yeah, it's a good point. Who knows?
Yeah.
I guess I default to the, random mutations happen all the time, and usually they're not advantageous. But so we can sort of deduce when this might have happened too, when this would have happened. And it's most likely between 160,000 and 300,000 years ago. And the reason we know that is, or can say that it is most likely, we're dealing with probabilities here, so it's possible to be outside of that range, but it's most likely in that range. Before that, humanity hadn't emerged yet from the sort of soup of various human groups in Africa. And then 160,000 years ago is when we had our most recent genetic bottleneck of mitochondrial Eve. So this is this concept of everyone alive today has mitochondrial DNA that comes from this one woman who would have lived in East Africa 160,000 years ago. And you can date that based on genetic dating. And that means that, we all come from that womb ultimately. Like every single person alive is descended from her. And so that would have meant that, she would have lived in a tribe. Maybe there were hundreds of Homo sapiens at that point. Maybe it was a couple dozen. And everyone else's lineage died out. But hers is the only one that propagated to now. So she most likely had this mutation because we all, as far as we know, everyone alive today has the HTK-TL1 variation, the mutated version. So we probably got it from her. So the mitochondrial Eve probably had this mutation, which means that's kind of your time bounding of when this would have happened, 300,000 to 160,000 years ago.
Fascinating. So is it then this whole, because, I was kind of thinking like animals, I don't know if they have an appreciation for scarce assets. Like you see squirrels, hiding nuts and stuff. Like, what is this something? Is this appreciation for scarce assets something that makes us distinctly human?
Versus other early human groups, I think. Yeah. That's the relative.
And it's when I say appreciation, I guess this is the appreciation expressed in the action of accumulating these things.
Yes. And so I guess let's go back to the Neanderthal example of they didn't seem to collect seashells, but when Szabo wrote that in 2002, we had no examples. And since then, we found one example of seashells from a Neanderthal cave site in Spain, and a few other examples of Neanderthals collecting quartz and fossils and some other like strange items. So they had the capacity to appreciate something that was unusual and value it occasionally, right? But we've only seen that one example of shell bead jewelry by Neanderthals, and versus Homo sapiens, where there's a ton. Similarly, we saw the one example of cave art from Neanderthals and a few other examples of Neanderthal art. But then Homo sapiens come along, and there's a ton of early human art. So I think that speaks to this hypothesis fits in with that, because Neanderthals would have had association cortices, but on a much more limited basis. They would have had less developed versions of the same brain structures.
Got it.
If that logic follows. And then this mutation just supercharges it and overdevelops our brain centers for abstract thought, which leads to symbolic behavior of valuing scarce assets and art, and then other things like religion. So in that sense, early humans had the capacity to appreciate scarcity, but like a dim interest or a limited drive to engage in that, to collect scarce assets. And without that drive, without that like level of covetous interest, you didn't meet the critical mass necessary to develop this like collectible fascination in a social group, which is the starting point for monetization.
Interesting. Do you go into the development of natural language at all? Because I don't know how that timeline parallels this timeline.
Yeah, I don't, except to say that, we used to think that Neanderthals didn't have like fully formed language. That was kind of the assumption. And more recently, we now think they had language. It's really hard with language because there's no evidence of it. So it's hard to say when things occurred. There is a really interesting sort of phenomenon in the paleoarchaeology record of when the Upper Paleolithic starts, which is when humanity arrives in Europe. Suddenly, tools are all rocks, that are shaped and formed into specific forms, and you go from a limited number of like tool types, templates really, to a bunch more that are like more precise and more. There's dozens all of a sudden of like specific forms that you see turning up over and over. And the suggestion is that maybe language becomes more fully formed around that time, such that you have the articulation of what this type of tool is.
Interesting.
And that makes it easier to repeat that form, and you start to develop like more distinct variations, rather than just like, tool that cuts. You'd have like a specific characterization of what this type of tool should look like and what it does.
That's interesting. More specialized tools. And I like the word articulation, kind of has two meanings. Right? Like articulate the word, but then also maybe articulate the topology of the stone tool, right? Yeah. And those things do, this was I think it's in Peterson's Maps of Meanings, but he says, and I can't cite the evidence off the top of my head, but he cited a lot of evidence that tool use, like intricate tool use and speech co-evolved around the same time. So exactly what you're saying, the sophistication of the tool kind of maps the sophistication of the speech. Yeah.
And it's interesting too that, this is like a long, slow process over like a million years really of like you see the earliest examples of like hand axes like a million years ago.
They call this napping. Is that what it was?
Yeah. So they'd take like a suitable rock and then hit it with another rock in a specific sort of way to develop a particular blade. And and that's the starting point, and you get way more sophisticated from there over many, many generations. But the starting point of it was like a million years ago. And, it's hard to say if they had any kind of language a million years ago, but fast forward to about 45,000 years ago, when humans arrive in Europe, and you start to see this like proliferation of specific forms of tools, of stone tool shapes. And you could totally see how the coevolution of what a specific, the labels, linguistic labels that you'd apply to what a tool should look like, and the, proliferation of these tools would go hand in hand.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then I'm just thinking about this out loud, but it seems like you would also need natural language co-evolving with money and trade for that to really work, right? Because they need to communicate with other tribes and negotiate and things like this. Yeah.
And, it's impossible to say how sophisticated those, the articulation of like, I want that, you give me that, like what that would have looked like over, what time scale. But what is clear is that we had shell beads 142,000 years ago And then, they're all over Africa and then the Middle East and Europe and Asia, over the 100,000 years that follow. And that would suggest that trade was going on, that proto-money existed for those early humans, and some limited or perhaps rather fully articulated sense of language was already there. But, what we have evidence of is the stone tools and then these seashells, which to me is quite, and to Szabo, is quite obviously proto-money, and dismissing it as something else, as fashion in particular, is really rather nonsense.
We touched on this a little bit earlier, but what do you think? Why do you think mainstream academia is missing this? Is it because the lack of economic understanding?
Yeah. One of the things that was really funny when I was going down this rabbit hole of like, okay, what's the latest understanding of why Homo sapiens outcompeted Neanderthals and displaced or drove them extinct? And there's a paper published in 2018 from a team of Oxford PhDs that argues that the reason for this is that Homo sapiens were, quote, generalist specialists. And what they argue is that because we were able to thrive everywhere, that's the reason that we were successful. Which to me is completely circular logic.
I was gonna say, yeah. It's survival of the survivors.
Exactly. So it's like, oh, okay, great. So we were good at living places, so that's why we're alive. And that, if that's what's coming from, contemporary anthropology, they're clearly missing, the multi-domain subject matter from other domains that is necessary to make sense of this puzzle. Back to praxeology, Austrian economics already being sorely omitted from the economics profession. Of course, it's not in any of these other ones. Yeah, and it's so I think the things that anthropology are missing is Austrian economics. Bitcoin is also helpful here, because it helps put into context Austrian economics and commodity money, and scarcity and our value of scarcity. And then the neuroscience element, which, it's really cool that this neuroscience study came out that speaks to Neanderthals, the difference between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, but that's kind of outside of what anthropologists want to do. They want to do archaeology and interpret based on self-expression and individual meaning what they find, and put things together in a very human way. But neuroscience is its own field. Yeah, it's strange because this itself might be a bit of a fiat problem, this kind of hyper specialization and getting super siloed and ignoring, there's not as much generalization as we've had in the past. When before science was called science, they called it natural philosophy, and it was kind of trying to incorporate a lot of things. Can we, because this is such an important term in your essay and to this entire process you're describing, can we define the term scarcity? Yeah, it's a good point. I don't offer up a definition precisely. I do talk about sort of the very human experience of seeing a seashell and valuing it because it's beautiful, but also because it's rare, and you know that it's something uncommon and special. Yeah. And I think that's a part of the definition of scarcity that we sometimes don't think about, because strictly speaking, we can talk about the hard money definition of scarcity as that which is that which has a low supply dilution over time. Meaning that there's not much more being made of it every year. And obviously we've, in the Austrian economics branch of economics focuses on commodity money and views everything through that lens, which is, I think, the natural and like historically aligned lens of understanding money, as opposed to fiat, which is Keynesian. And in that context, they're studying like why did certain commodities become money, and then why did other commodities displace those as money? And your essays on glass beads and cloth strips is part of that story, that lineage of early commodity money. And the story of monetary history is this Darwinian process of commodities that were suitable as money being bested by commodities that were fitter monies. Yeah. Specifically because of their superior scarcity, meaning that they were harder to make more of. And so this term of hard money, the harder money wins, is hand in hand. I guess it's the inverse of scarcity, right? Like how hard is something to make more of is therefore how scarce the existing supply is.
Yeah, inverse of the inflation rate.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's the story of monetary history, is us marching through local optimums that then get bested by a superior commodity that can be used as money. And then we end up on gold, right? Like gold emerges 6,000 years ago in the Danube River Valley because of the Varna culture's advances in metallurgy. They were able to like synthesize gold and work with gold. Not synthesize, but extract it and work with it as a material. And that begins the gold era and introduces gold as a competitor on the global stage. And then the 6,000 years of history that followed is gold taking over the world, right? Because it's the best physical commodity that is a suitable money, specifically because it is the scarcest suitable money. It's the hardest to make more of anything out there. For the last 100 years, we've averaged 1.5 to 2% supply dilution every year for gold, meaning that's how much gold miners are able to add to the existing supply every year. That's better than anything else. It's better than seashells. It's better than glass beads, as you enumerated with the Venetian example, which is so interesting.
The way I put the same point is like, we're always experimenting to find the best tool for the job. The job of money is divisibility, durability, recognizability, portability, scarcity. And monetary metals are basically best at fulfilling all of those functions, but of the monetary metals, gold is the most scarce. And it is a tricky word because like in economics, strictly speaking, there's the whole idea of scarcity is just anywhere demand exceeds supply. So there's more demand for a thing than there is supply of a thing. Therefore, there is a market for the thing, right? People will bid for it. There's a market price, et cetera. It's subtly distinct from rarity because, I could paint my one of one painting here, but I don't know how to paint. So no one wants it. So it's super rare, one of one.
And everyone else can paint.
And but if there's no demand because I don't have good painting skills, then it's like, it's not scarce, right? You can say it's super rare, but not scarce. And the flip side of that is like, people often associate scarcity with value. And that's like not, what was I going to say here? There's certain things that are very valuable, but they don't have a market price because they're not scarce, right? Like oxygen is the example I commonly cite, right? Clearly very essential to life. None of us make it that long without it, but it's so hyper abundant. We don't price it. Not yet. Hopefully that's not like some dark dystopian future. But the strange thing about money is that because it is a means to all material ends, right? It can be used to acquire any good or service the marketplace can bear. It has this like natural scarcity built into it, and that there's always more demand for money than there is supply for money.
Yeah.
So then we kind of assign that property to money of scarcity because it's always scarce. And then it's like a matter of which monetary technology has the least flexible supply so that increases in demand don't increase the supply.
Right.
And that Global optimum became gold, basically.
Yes. Now it's possible to have a scarcer good that's suitable as money.
Would you rather have 1 Bitcoin today or 2 Bitcoin a few years from now? Bitcoin mining is a tried and true strategy for accumulating Bitcoin. Over a 2 to 4 year time frame, successful miners have consistently accumulated more Bitcoin than they otherwise would with a traditional dollar cost average strategy. Blockware mining as a service enables you to start mining Bitcoin from your laptop. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost power to configuring the mining pool. They do it all. Plus, with Blockware's one-of-a-kind mining marketplace, you can buy and sell live Bitcoin miners with just a few keystrokes. In this marketplace, buyers get to purchase live machines at vetted facilities, enabling them to mine with zero lead time. And sellers get the opportunity to liquidate their machines and hosting contracts at will. This means you can mine Bitcoin with zero long-term commitment and high liquidity on your mining rigs. Blockware will even cover your energy bill for 1 week per mining rig when you sign up at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Again, that's 1 free week of Bitcoin mining at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. And on top of this offer, you can also use code BREEDLOVE to get $100 off your first mining rig with Blockware Solutions. Bitcoin custody is evolving. Both self-custody and single third-party custody come with significant risk and trade-offs. Onramp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your setup. Onramp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-sig vault guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which that have unilateral control over your assets. More than just security, Onramp simplifies inheritance and estate planning, ensuring your Bitcoin wealth moves seamlessly to your loved ones without the risk and complexities of self-custody. Easily designate beneficiaries right in the Onramp dashboard, eliminating the need for unreliable treasure maps or other complex key sharing schemes. You can also avoid the probate process and ensure your heirs receive their Bitcoin securely with legal title transfers designed to keep your wealth intact for generations. As Bitcoin continues to appreciate, Onramp helps you seamlessly access financial services, from inheritance and insurance to trading, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security. And importantly, the onboarding process is fast and frictionless. I set up my own Onramp account, and it was far easier than dealing with hardware wallets or traditional self-custody setups. The team walked me through everything step by step, making sure I had a secure, reliant setup for my Bitcoin wealth. Secure your generational wealth with confidence. Schedule a consultation with the Onramp team today at onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. Again, that's onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. Have we perfected scarcity in Bitcoin?
Yes, I think, in my opinion, it is the invention of, or discovery of, depending on how you look at it, of absolute scarcity, because it's not possible in the physical world to have a finite supply of anything. Mm-hmm. You can always make more. Even with art, like people point at Picasso, you can't make more Picassos, but you can always pick the next new hot artist, and the total supply of art expands. Or you could find more Picassos too. Mm-hmm. Anyway, in the physical world, it's not possible to have a finite supply, but it's possible in the digital realm. And Bitcoin is the invention of that, the first system that invents digital scarcity. And luckily, probably because Satoshi was an absolute genius, he took that to the extreme and invented absolute scarcity. And then incredibly cleverly, he also implemented a system of increasing scarcity. So, the halvings amount to increasing scarcity, terminating an absolute scarcity. Yeah. And what we're living through is this the early stages of the world waking up to, there is a monetary good that becomes more scarce every 4 years that you hold it. Mm-hmm. And it will eventually be absolutely scarce. There will never be any more made of it, as opposed to real estate, equities, and company equity, art, gold, everything else in the physical analog world that you can always make more of. And so Bitcoin is the perfection of scarcity. And what's wild about that, in the context of this piece, is that scarcity and appreciating and valuing scarcity appears to have been our evolutionary competitive advantage over other early humans. So if that's what defines us as humans. It's what separates our species from other early humans. And then along comes Bitcoin, and it's literally the perfection of that which makes us human. And I think, and I think that what we're seeing in the first 16 years of Bitcoin's monetization is every Homo sapiens, which is everyone, has it in their DNA to appreciate and value scarcity based on this genetic mutation. And that means that now that we're interacting with perfect scarcity, it's this inevitable gravitation, species-wide gravitation to this new thing, because this is what we've been searching for our entire species history. And here is the perfection of that which makes us human. And this is a once in a species event.
Wow. It's profound, right? And people that maybe haven't done the work or dug into Bitcoin deeply often think it sounds hyperbolic, perhaps. If it's that which makes, or at least, I don't want to say that which makes us human, because there are so many things now that make us human, but it's like it was the starting point, right? The thing that started.
The thing that separated us.
Yes.
And it's the thing that enabled so many of the things that we point to as human. It enabled art.
Yes.
Because it enabled the aggregation of larger social groups. And that's when you start to see the specialization of labor. That's when you start to have artists and other, tradesmen, because you're living in larger social groups, you're living in like proto-civilization. And then everything that, we point to as human comes from that context. But what enabled it was this ability to appreciate scarcity and this covetous interest in scarce assets that then kickstarts the bootstrapping of the concept of money.
Yes. Yeah. And to like try to pry that open a little bit, the appreciation of scarcity, which again is embodied in the action of accumulating and saving the thing. In this case, it was seashells over time. That it seems like it has something to do with metacognition, and that you almost take the perspective of the other. Yeah. Right. And you start thinking like, I've seen people over time do useful work for these seashells, and you see that, you expect that to persist into the future. So then all of a sudden you can start accumulating this thing and then think about your legacy and your future lineage and whatnot. So there's this sort of metacognitive thing going on with, and again, I don't know, chicken, egg, I'm not really sure, but there definitely seemed to be this upgrade in human cognition, human cooperation, as we're describing through trade and economics, and perhaps even religion, perhaps even morality, if we take Hoppe's point seriously. So if scarcity is kind of the seed for all of this, what is absolute scarcity? Is this something, is this going to do something new to us?
Right. Yeah, that's right. And that's where it's so exciting about what I like to talk about, the bright orange future of what Bitcoin makes possible, or a lot of the trends that Bitcoin can reverse. I mean, we mentioned the enshittification of everything, how all goods in the fiat standard have to, be made worse or their prices raised, right? Like
or both.
Those are your, right. Or both. Those are your choices. And And that's because we have an inflationary monetary standard. And if you have a deflationary monetary standard, which you do have with Bitcoin, if you're not making any more, if there's a finite supply, but the economy continues to grow, then you get more for your share of the existing monetary supply.
Yes, your money buys more over time. Yeah.
And that's deflationary. So if we shift from an inflationary flywheel of everything getting worse because all prices have to go up.
Prices go up, quality go down.
Yep.
You flip that.
You flip it.
Yeah.
And you start the flywheel in the other direction, which is what we saw from the closest thing we had to a deflationary monetary standard was the American Revolution to 1913. 150 years where gold was money and the economy was growing faster than the gold supply. So you were getting more for less. And what did that do to tradesmen is they had to make a choice of, okay, I either lower my prices or I make my product, my service better and retain the same price that I'm asking from customers. So, and that is the flywheel cycle of craftsmanship.
Yeah.
Everything gets better over time.
It sounds like very central to civilization too.
Yeah.
Things getting cheaper and better over time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Bitcoin rips us out of this fiat flywheel of everything getting worse and offers us a flywheel of everything getting better over time. And I think that's what happens to people who embrace Bitcoin as their unit of account, as a core part of their savings strategy. I view Bitcoin as a savings technology that is the core of my financial world. And my life gets better over every 4 years.
Yeah.
And that's because I've embraced this deflationary monetary standard. And that's a choice that everybody on earth gets to make. Every day, everybody wakes up and 99.9% of people continue to use fiat as their monetary standard. But some people wake up and say, I'm going to choose to make Bitcoin my monetary standard. And then those people see their lives getting better over time. Yes.
No, I love that. And it's so, I like how the framing of the essay presents it such that we're really just following what our ancestors did to get to this point, right? It's like the recognition of scarcity as a superior monetary property, and then you accumulate that one. Obviously the past 100 years are a bit of a weird period because we have fiat, but if you look over, I think you said 6,000 years ago was when gold sort of came online, that's been the pattern basically. What do we say to people that are maybe skeptical that Bitcoin can become that? And I want you to think about this in terms of what you said earlier, where you're describing how a collectible becomes a store of value, becomes a medium of exchange, becomes a unit of account. Like, is this a pathway you think Bitcoin will follow as well to get to that bright orange future?
Yeah, and that's what I think the Austrian economists do a great job of. They just studied what has happened, and they explain the process of a commodity like seashells or glass beads or little bits of metal. How did that become money? And you have to have a very logical, stepwise process because you can't make the jump. You can't just decide overnight, like, okay, everybody, we're all going to value glass beads. It has to be an organic process that is in line with individual decision making. And that is what they enumerated, that it goes from collectible to store of value to medium of exchange to unit of account. And I think we can all say that Bitcoin is already a digital collectible. Like, the majority of the world views Bitcoin as a digital collectible. The majority of the world doesn't own Bitcoin, but they wish they did because they see that it has value. It's okay. It's a digital collectible. And we're in the stage now where we're transitioning from a small group of humans valuing this collectible to everyone recognizing that Bitcoin has value. we're going through that process of Bitcoin transitioning from most of the world viewing Bitcoin as a collectible to most of the world viewing Bitcoin as a store of value asset. And then we'll keep building from there. And the way I think about it is each function of money, collectible, store of value, and so on, is its own S-curve of technology adoption.
Okay.
And so you're going to move through the bell curve of technology adopters for each function of money. And we've already gotten through probably the majority of the bell curve for that first function, collectibles. But we're still in the early stages of people recognizing Bitcoin as a store of value asset.
Yeah.
So, and then, we're even earlier in the process for medium of exchange and unit of account.
Yeah.
I think that's what it means to be a Bitcoin maximalist, is to, or whatever term you want to use for it, is to view Bitcoin as the primary pillar of your saving strategy.
Yeah.
And that's how I view it. And that's how other, Bitcoin advocates view it. And that means pricing everything in Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so I'm on a Bitcoin unit of account, but there's not very many of us, right? Like maybe 100,000 in the world who are at that level of Bitcoin adoption. And, so each of these S curves is in its own level of progression through the bell curve. And that's just how this process plays out. And it plays out year by year, people learning about Bitcoin. It plays out cycle by cycle as Bitcoin's increasing scarcity ratchets up. Then that causes, the price of Bitcoin to go up because we're producing less of it. And then generation by generation too, like kids who are growing up today know Bitcoin as a store of value asset. And like baby boomers don't view it as a store of value asset, but eventually we will live in a world where everyone has only known Bitcoin existing and being reliable. And that, I think, is part of how we as a civilization will slowly, inevitably march through that path dependent process of Bitcoin going from digital collectible to the best money on earth.
Yes. Fantastic. We laid that out. I like to cite that quote. I won't attribute it, but science advances from funeral to funeral.
Yes.
So like you do need, for these new ideas to propagate, it does take a dying off of people that adhere to the old ideas. And of course, this is a generalization, right? There's old people that get Bitcoin, there's young people, but broadly speaking, because it's a digital native money, it tends to be more favored by digital native people, right?
Yep.
People that have grown up with digital technology, which is not even me, but like I'm an old millennial. I'm 39. I didn't grow up with it. I mean, I guess I did grow up with video games and whatnot, but I didn't grow up with an iPhone, for instance.
Right.
So I'm kind of on this cusp. There also I like the successive S curve. Oh, I'm sorry, S curve. Is that right?
Yeah, it'd be like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of goes what?
It's exponential for the first half, and then it goes slow down and plateau.
Got it. Okay. Right. So that's right. Slow beginning.
Yep.
Steep, and then kind of late laggards coming in. Yeah.
Yes.
But 4 successive ones, one for each function of money, but these aren't discrete adoption curves. They're overlapping.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there's different people, as you said, maybe 100,000 people are already in the unit of account phase.
Yep.
That one's interesting too, because if you price homes in Bitcoin,
yep.
Home prices are down 99+% over the past 10 years.
Yeah.
And if you just say that to someone like, hey, guy on the street, did you know home prices are down 99% over the past 10 years? I'd be like, you're completely full of shit. Like, what are you talking about? Like,
right.
Home prices go up all the time. They're up. Well, I don't know the percentage, probably 100% or more in the past 10 years.
It's all based on the unit of account that they're thinking in terms of.
Exactly. And this is that strange psychological thing. It's like you have to realize that it's a reference frame or a frame of reference for you. And you got to take off those glasses and try on something new, basically. Mm-hmm. What do you think of those different adoption curves? Do you think it's going to be people chasing number go up? Do you think it's going to be people probably a combination of all the things, but people using Bitcoin to say like an unstoppable medium of exchange, or people adopting this as like kind of their frame of reference, so to speak, in pricing their own net worth or their business activities. Which one's going to be really driving Bitcoin adoption?
Yeah, that's where I think Satoshi's, I think it's underrated that Satoshi implemented the halvings system.
Yeah.
Because that increasing scarcity for the next 120 years forces, the value of the Bitcoin that you hold today to be more in 4 years, when there's suddenly less Bitcoin being created every day. That's incredible. That's never been possible before with any asset, and that is the basis for number go up. So like if there were no more adopters of Bitcoin, it's just people who believe in Bitcoin today, continue to believe in Bitcoin, the price of Bitcoin will go up because you're the same set of people competing over less new supply every 4 years.
Yeah.
And so that's just Marshall Cross supply and demand meeting. Suddenly there's less supply being created, and where supply and demand meet shifts and on the y-axis, and price goes up. Like get rid of all the noise. That's the mechanics of what's happening. So if no new adopters still means the price of Bitcoin goes up, and people learn about that, you're going to have new adopters.
Yes. Yeah. This is so, yeah.
So I think the core brilliance of Bitcoin is number go up. And that drives adoption, because everybody's acting in personal interest. Like, I'm going to adopt Bitcoin as part of my savings strategy because it's going to grow in value. And that's game theory playing out. And as people recognize that this is the game theory, everyone has an incentive to adopt it because it will go up in value over time. Then you start to realize, like, as soon as people learn about this, everyone's going to adopt it.
Yeah.
And it's sort of that cycle of like the having that root driver of number go up because of increasing scarcity, and then the game theory layering on top of that makes it inevitable, I think, that the world will adopt Bitcoin as a savings technology.
One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably get it. You get that Bitcoin upends everything that state-sponsored schools teach us about money. For those who get the importance of Bitcoin, it is important that we have a smart way to buy and hold Bitcoin. My friends at Coinbits, the oldest Bitcoin-only exchange in the United States, have pioneered the concept of roundups, which converts your spare change into Bitcoin. Simply connect your credit or debit cards, and your usual purchases are rounded up to the nearest dollar, letting you stack sats on every purchase without even thinking about it. Coinbits also provides a terrific self-custody experience. Connect a hardware wallet for automatic withdrawals into cold storage to minimize your risk and stay sovereign over your Bitcoin. My favorite Coinbits feature is Coinbits Plus, which gives you the best exchange rate on Bitcoin. It even gives you real-time feedback on how well you are doing on your savings plan. With Coinbits Plus, power users can save more money to buy even more Bitcoin. All that, plus peer-to-peer cash and Bitcoin payments, target orders, price alerts, and more, means Coinbits can help you do almost anything you need to do with Bitcoin. So go to coinbits.app/breedlove to sign up today. Again, that is Coinbits, bits.app/breedlove. When I was going down my own rabbit hole journey, there was this game theoretic. When I got into this, I started flirting with that word too inevitable. I still don't like to use it because it's so, but.
And you have to allow for like fringe, there are unknown unknowns.
Yes. Black swans.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, for sure. And that's ineradicable, right? You can't do anything about black swans. That's like the definition of a black swan. It's an unknowable unknown kind of thing. But when you're trying to study Bitcoin and you end up in like, well, the only thing that can take this out is like an unknowable unknown.
Yes.
That's pretty good for your thesis. But this whole idea, that there's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy to it. And then, and this is not just true with Bitcoin. This is also true with money more broadly. So like, for instance, inflation is often described as a psychological phenomenon. Because if market actors, say dollar users, expect the dollar to decline in value over time, then the rational, prudent action is to sell those dollars for something else that's not going to decline in value over time. And those acts thereby cause the dollar to decline over time. So you get this weird feedback loop where expectations become reality. Like there's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy to it. But Bitcoin is that reversed, right? It's like we do know with essentially perfect certainty that the supply curve is diminished by 50% every 4 years, right? So the newly issued Bitcoin is getting cut in half every 4 years. And as you said, if you just no new adoption, just hold demand constant, but supply issuance gets cut in half. Another way to think about this is like the natural sellers of Bitcoin, which are the miners, that selling pressure gets cut in half. Well, then number go up, price go up. And so it gets really interesting when you map Bitcoin's historic price action on the halving epochs, and you see something like, every time there's a halving, roughly 18 months later, there's a new all-time high price. And we've seen that play out 4 times, I guess, at this point.
Yeah.
And we're working on the 5th, I think is the number. I could be wrong on that, but my thought has always been, how many times does this iteration need to play out before people really start to wake up and be like, it's just going to keep doing this?
Yeah.
And at that point, they start to act on that prediction, which is to like hoard Bitcoin, basically.
Yep.
And that creates the self-fulfilling prophecy of hyper-Bitcoinization. This thing will eventually just break that model too, to the upside. And then it's like, the game theory of Bitcoin is such that you can't think of a scenario where it doesn't just go to infinity.
Yeah.
And that's weird.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what drove me to write this article, is to try to put it in this context of like why is it like that this thing is as like world conquering as it appears to be. And when I think this article adds a bit of explanation to our quiver of like what is going on with Bitcoin. Why is it so compelling to us? Well, it's because it's in our DNA to appreciate scarcity, and that human evolution is a story of monetary evolution. And then along comes Bitcoin, and it's the perfection of that which we've been searching for over 142,000 years. And that, I think, helps explain the zealousness that you feel when you understand Bitcoin and the magnitude. There's nothing in the world that compares to the scale of what Bitcoin is doing to change the future of humanity.
Yeah.
And that's a crazy thing to like grapple with, right? And to try to make sense of. And I think that this explanation of like, it's, this genetic mutation that has led us to outcompete other early humans, it's part of what defines us as a species. And it's part of why we gravitate towards scarcity. And then along comes Bitcoin, and it is exactly what we've been looking for thousands of generations. And we just happen to be lucky enough to be living during the early innings of the perfection of our defining attribute as a species. Yeah,
it's so well put. I reflect on and have big gratitude for that a lot. Just to be alive in the transition. I guess I was 23 when Bitcoin was launched, so I didn't grok it that early, but to even be able to see the world a little bit before and then see, I don't know, who knows how far it's going to go in one's lifetime, but to be at that inflection point is fascinating. I want to use the term bright orange future earlier, and I want to maybe just speculate a bit more on that. Other things. So we've already touched on Bitcoin, like perfects. We didn't get into the other monetary properties, but I would argue and have argued that it perfects all the monetary properties. Like it's ideal money in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Including fungibility. That's the one, I think.
That's the one that it does. And there's others too. Like even, you could argue like portability at layer one is maybe not optimized because you don't have the transaction throughput, but I guess I'm sort of assuming layer twos work, and I assume layer twos solve transaction throughput and privacy, which would be fungibility.
Yeah.
So that is a big assumption that doesn't exist yet. So yeah, thank you for that caveat. So these are, Bitcoin is like kind of an ideal money. It's definitely absolute scarcity, at least, or well, so far, I guess even that's probabilistic to some extent.
Yeah.
But other things that it does that are really interesting, the fact that it acts as a global bounty program for cheaper energy.
Yeah.
This obviously has major consequences for energy markets and then by extension, the global economy, because energy is an input to every industrial process, basically. So when you decrease the cost of energy, it's roughly equivalent to increasing aggregate wealth production, right?
Yep.
Which is another way of saying you're making the cost of everything that energy goes into, which is basically everything, the cost goes down as energy goes down. Also the idea of Bitcoin, because it's very hard to steal, actually increases aggregate productivity, because the way I think about it is this, like every moment that someone spends stealing from someone else, that's a moment they did not spend engaged in productive activity.
Yep.
And so if you reduce the possibility of stealing, whether this be inflation, taxation, actual confiscation, or even fiat regulation, I think is you could put in that bucket to some extent. When all of these things get reduced, if not eliminated, well, then if whoever was making money that way all of a sudden has no option,
you got to be productive.
Go be an entrepreneur, right? Yeah. Or an employee, I should say. Go be productive. You're right. I don't know. I threw a lot of things at you, but I just want you to like maybe in your thinking about the bright orange future, where do you think of these leverage points or other leverage points that you may have identified, like where do you think Bitcoin really will shine and what benefits should we expect?
Yeah, it's incredible to think about that, the scale of that. There's one example I really like of, I go back to craftsmanship first and foremost, because it's kind of hard to imagine living in a world of increasing craftsmanship because we're so accustomed to the inverse. But if you go to Paris and you walk on the bridges, you see these lampposts that are beautiful wrought iron lampposts that were funded by public money in the Gilded Age, 120 years ago. And they're incredible, and they're for the public good, and they're done by craftsmen who, improved their trade because they wanted to, keep commanding the same price in this culture, this era of craftsmanship. And if you were to imagine a bridge being made today and what the lamppost would look like, it's a stark difference, right? And so it permeates everything. That's just a tiny example of something you wouldn't even notice in your day-to-day. You walk across the bridge because you need to get somewhere, but in doing so, you're walking through beauty and appreciating the work that humans are capable of.
Yeah.
And the opposite example is sad.
Yeah.
It's brutalist, right?
Yeah.
And so I like focusing on that tiny example, because if you magnify that, multiply that by a million times, there's a million different things during each day that you're touching something that would be better under a culture of craftsmanship. And instead you have the inverse. And what would your life be like if you lived on a deflationary monetary standard where you have craftsmanship making everything better and more beautiful? The answer is like, it's impossible to fully encapsulate how much better that version of the world is than what we're accustomed to.
Yeah, it's a great framing. I think it goes back full circle to the beginning, actually, right? Just art.
Yes.
Right. Having more beautiful surroundings, right? It's not, again, it's hard to put a number onto these things, but man, the most expensive assets, singular assets in the world are works of art, right? I mean, some of them are even priceless. And that gets back into this whole human, what's going on there? Like, what is it about, people flying all over the world, from all over the world, let's say, to go and see the Mona Lisa in person? And like, why do we put so much value onto these works of art? And what does it mean if our world broadly, and on the fiat standard, which is leading to this kind of brutalist architectural paradigm, like what is it doing to our soul?
Yeah. What is it doing to our soul? But like, what to that behavior of like, why do we want to go be in front of the Mona Lisa? It's funny that, it does come full circle here, because this mutation, this TKTL1 mutation, would amplify, overdevelop, supercharge our abstract thought centers and our drive to engage in symbolic behavior. And that's art, and that's a bunch of other things, and it's collectibles. And so, we think about, what makes us special as humans is this drive towards art and this appreciation of art. But I think we've had it wrong that the real difference maker was coveting scarce assets that enabled and unlocked the series of benefits that allowed us to develop civilization. And meanwhile, we get this additional benefit of having like a greater appreciation for art and a drive for art. So that's not what separated us, but it's part of this story of humanity. We love art and we are compelled by it because of the same mutation. But what really separated us as a species and enabled civilization was the monetary side of it. And then that monetary side allows us to have civilization, and then we can engage in the beauty of art and satisfy our souls in that way.
Yeah. No, that's a great point too. We start to create so much economic residual through the collaboration that we're unlocking through money, that we then can have great works of art that sell for multiple millions of dollars or are even priceless. Right? It's almost like a visual manifestation of the fruits of collaboration we've unlocked, something like that. The other interesting thing about art, and this might tie into this money thing too, probably most art museums in the world today, you'll go and see art, let's say in the UK, but that art didn't come from the UK, right? It was pillaged from India centuries ago or whatever. I've heard even that the crown jewel of if it's maybe the Queen of England, maybe the King, I forget which one. I think the Queen was actually a jewel stolen from India centuries ago. So like there again, in art and art museums, we see this. I mean, it's not very emphasized, but there is this history of humans stealing from one another and fighting and warring, and that kind of antagonistic dynamic that has overlaid a lot of our cooperative dynamics. And so, I guess, what am I trying to say here? It's like this ability to abstract that we're broadly calling like art or symbolic capability, it is just a tool ultimately, right?
Yeah.
It's not morally right or wrong.
Right. It doesn't make us morally more evolved.
Yes.
It just changes the game theory of human coordination.
Yes.
Because, that stark example of like, if you don't have money, then the tribe next door is just always your enemy.
Yes.
Versus if you have money, the tribe next door could be your ally. Like, because you could be stronger together.
Yeah.
If you're able to mediate that relationship with something besides violence.
Yeah.
And so, it goes back to that.
So let's linger on one last thing then, because this is, we got to gold, and then gold let us scale civilization to the point we're at today. But gold is still physical. So when, Germany conquered Poland, for instance, they raided their central bank and took all their gold. So because it's physical, there's still a credible threat of physical violence associated with being on a physical monetary standard like gold. But Bitcoin is non-physical. Much harder to confiscate in that way. Do you think this has significant implications for how we organize ourselves socially going forward?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the idea that Bitcoin defunds war, which is sort of related to, like what's the logic of violence in this gold standard era? Yes, you could go confiscate their gold and take it home, and that's your Viking sort of mentality, right? In the fiat era, since you can print money, you can fund total war, right? Like you can issue war bonds and print money out of thin air to issue war bonds through a slyer way, right? Like you're debasing your currency and robbing your citizens in order to fund further war. So Bitcoin gets rid of both of those problems. The Achilles heel of gold is its physicality, and that tends towards centralization, and then you get promissory notes issued on that, and then you end up with fiat. If Bitcoin doesn't have that Achilles heel, it's like Achilles without a weakness, And
then, so what do you think that looks like? Like, do you subscribe to, the sovereign individual thing? Like we move beyond the nation state paradigm, or what do you think about that?
That's hard for me to imagine. And I haven't spent much time thinking about those questions. I do think about, you touch on the energy side of it too. I think that's pretty concrete how Bitcoin it's a tailwind for energy development of all kind, but especially energy that has low input requirements, like nuclear. Yeah. Where you get a lot of energy out of a certain material. Potentially also renewable energy, like, if the balance of that really makes sense in terms of the material inputs and the energy outputs, you could end up with Dyson sphere sort of, the incentive to create the Dyson sphere of put a bunch of solar panels floating in space around the sun, like that. Bitcoin helps civilization head in that direction because there's always a buyer for energy, right? And in the Dyson sphere sort of paradigm, who's the buyer of energy, right? Like ostensibly you'd have some sort of factories in space that would be closely in close proximity to that energy creation because you don't want to transmit it over tons of space. But before those factories are there, it's Bitcoin, right? Like Bitcoin is the first buyer of energy for any new energy producing installation on Earth or in space. And so that's a very concrete, like Bitcoin adds a tailwind to energy development, which is a tailwind to industry development, which is a tailwind to civilization development.
So cool. So cool. Did we Did I miss anything major in your essay that you wanted to hit on?
I think we covered all the.
There's a timeline at the end. I guess we should probably mention that.
So tying it all together, I put a timeline in of what this would mean, this version of human evolution and monetary development. And when I put it all together, it's kind of amazing how it makes sense. Like if this mutation was, what was necessary for us to help to get to the point where we could develop the concept of money, and this mutation happened 300,000 to 160,000 years ago. And then we see the earliest evidence of shell money shows up 142,000 years ago in a cave site in Morocco. And we probably had earlier versions of it too that we will find but have not yet found. Anyway, that timeline kind of stands out of like, okay, so this mutation occurred, and then not that much later, we see evidence of shell bead proto money. Mm-hmm. And then, it takes tens of thousands of years for a band of Homo sapiens from East Africa to colonize Africa, and overtake all other early humans, and then colonize the Middle East and Asia and Europe. It takes a lot of time, and there would have been a lot of false starts and dead ends along the way. But it happened. We quickly displaced the Neanderthals. And then you see the explosion of human culture from that point forward. And when you march through that timeline, it all kind of paints a picture of, yes, this could have been the root cause for why Homo sapiens outcompeted Neanderthals and other early humans along the way. And it could be like, it feels strange to be in a position where like I might have sort of stumbled into a possible, potentially groundbreaking new hypothesis for why humanity outcompeted other early humans and what separates us as a species, and then why civilization developed. And it all comes back to scarcity, which Bitcoin has now perfected.
Mind blowing. Makes me super excited for whatever percentage of this path I get to see in my life.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
Jesse, I really appreciate you coming out here. This has been an awesome conversation. I'm sure people are going to love it. Where can people find out more about you or your work on the internet?
Yeah. You can read this article at onceinaspecies.com. That's my Substack, and I put out pieces occasionally. But I recommend reading this article because I turned it into it. It's a fun ride. It's a 14-minute read, and I took care to make it an enjoyable experience. You can also find me on Twitter, Jesse Meyers, at Croesus_BTC.
Awesome. We'll link to all that in the show notes. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.